loves, and welcome to another episode of Strange Playgrounds. It's been an interesting time of late. I've been reconnecting, largely through other people, reconnecting with a lot of stuff, a lot of material that I haven't experienced for a long time. So, thanks to David Feggiani, who some of you know from his E-Goats podcast, and some of you know from this channel. We did an episode of Strange Playgrounds regarding our experiences with the Commodore Amiga. Not terribly long ago, I reconnected with Gormenghast and Mervyn Peake's work, which has been wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Gormenghast is, as I'm sure you're sick of me rambling about now, Gormenghast is one of the most beautiful works of fantasy ever written. It's one of the most beautiful works ever written, to be honest. I mean, Mervyn Peake writes like no one else. It is truly unique. If he's the kind of writer who, were he around today, he wouldn't get published. It's just as simple as that. He wouldn't get published. He would be like kicked out of creative writing classes and whatnot, because he doesn't have any particular notion of restraint or restriction or of rule, even basic rules even. There are entire swathes of Gormenghast that are just diversions, and yet they're wonderful. Good example. In book 2, Gormenghast, the entire sequence with the teachers. The teachers of Gormenghast, the professors, do nothing for the story. I mean, absolutely nothing. They are their own little self-contained tangent. They could have easily been their own little self-contained gallows comedy work very, very easily, but somehow they fit, and it makes sense for them to be here. I don't know why, but it's the kind of work that defies any attempt to contain or redress it. There are sequences where the characters go off and do random weird things and act in very strange ways, and it just feeds the ethos. It's a story that's built on atmosphere and ethos as much as anything else. And I love that kind of storytelling. I love the unbridled imagination. I like the lack of restraint, and I like the flights of fancy and imagination that it results in. There is a kind of phenomena happening at the moment where, because of the way writers now do tend to interact and the way that particular communities form around writing itself, there is a tendency towards formula and template for particular tastes to be ascended above and beyond or enshrined above and beyond any others, and for particular notions of what writing is or what good writing is to crystallize to a certain degree. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not an absolute. There are massive positives happening right now in the realm of writing and publication. There is so much more in the way of variety than there ever was. There are so many more voices out there now than there ever was. I should know, I'm one of them, you know. My writing probably would never have gotten published in any kind of mainstream venue because it's just too out there, it's too bizarre, it's too weird. It doesn't cater to mainstream tastes, you know. It's not a sort of wider demographic kind of work. I don't do it for that, you know. And funnily enough, it's odd that Mervyn Peake managed to gain some degree of popular success. Of course, his success came posthumously, very like Lovecraft, very like Edgar Allan Poe, very like a lot of really great writers, you know. He didn't make a great deal of money from his writing when he was alive. In fact, he spent most of his life fairly impecunious and in really dire straits. He really did. Mervyn Peake was not a rich man. But it's strange and wonderful that it's managed to gain some degree of notification for what it represents. I mean, Gormenghast is really powerfully one of the most important works that you'll ever read with regards to literature. I mean, you need to, if you haven't read it, you kind of need to, especially if you're a fan of fantasy. It's one of those, it's like The Lord of the Rings, you know, you can't really understand the way fantasy has developed and the reason why it has developed the tropes and traditions that it has without reading Gormenghast, or without at least understanding it. In the same way, you can't really understand horror without having read people like Mary Shelley. It's impossible. You can understand it on an intuitive level, but to understand the contexts that cause particular tropes and traditions and cliches and forms of story to coalesce and sustain, you need to have read those works. It's just the way it is, you know? It's just the way it is. But another work I came across recently that I haven't even thought about for years and years was Heavy Rain. Do you remember Heavy Rain? Heavy Rain was a video game from 2010 that caused a massive stir. It was one of those video games that really, for whatever qualities it does or doesn't possess, changed the landscape of video gaming. It changed the way video games were made because it was created in the manner of a film. It's one of the earliest video games to have a genuine, proper filmic script behind it, to have like direction, voice acting, all that kind of thing. And of course, many video games had that before, but not to this degree, and not to this intensity. Apparently, the script for Heavy Rain was 2,000 pages plus, and a lot of it got cut. A lot of it hit the cutting room floor for space and for time. And it's a fascinating experiment, is Heavy Rain. It's fascinating more in terms of what it represents than in terms of what it is, unfortunately. The finished product, I've always had a few issues with, and I think a lot of people have always had a few issues with. It was advertised as being this incredible interactive murder mystery and psychological drama where what you do, the decisions you make, will have incredible impact upon the story. We're even told that it's essentially a murder mystery. We were told that what you do within the game, the decisions you make, will actually alter who the origami killer, the serial killer that is central to the plot, turns out to be. And that ultimately isn't the case. And it's very clear. There is this before we get into that, actually, let's talk about the story structure. Is really interesting. It's one of those stories that comes from multiple different perspectives. So you play multiple different characters, all of whom are tangentially or directly involved with this string of serial murders that are happening, whom the press have dubbed the origami murders, because the killer always leaves a little origami bird at the site of the murders, and the murders are always kind of Saw-like, but there's always some puzzle involved. There's always some greater meaning or communication behind them, and they all involve drowning. The origami killer always leaves his victims to drown in the rain. The area where the killings occur experiences regular rainfall that's quite dramatic. So the victims are often found in storm drains, for example, or like abandoned areas where they will eventually drown and no one can find or help them. But there seems to be some greater communication going on. He seems to interact with his victims, and he's trying almost to teach them something in the manner of like Saw or Jigsaw, for example. The characters involved are all damaged, broken people whom the origami killer leads through their own neuroses and dreads. I mean, one of the principal characters is the father of a child who was ultimately killed in I believe it was a hit and run, and it's largely because of his neglect that it happened. He was living an almost Edenic, perfect life, which you get to play through, actually, as an architect. He had a great marriage, he had 2 children, and his child gets away from him at one point in the opening sequence and is knocked down by a car and ends up dying. And that sends him into a tailspin of self-recrimination and despair. Another one is an investigative journalist who has some dirt in her past. Another one is a private detective who also has some issues that he's working through. And you play through trying to discover clues as to who the origami killer is. You can do certain things with each character that impact upon the others, and which do, to a degree, affect the story, but it always ultimately does come out the same. Some characters can die, some of them don't. Some characters can provide illumination where others don't, but there's not much really that ultimately changes, other than if you're successful or not. The killer is always the same killer. It's always the same character. There's a kind of M. Night Shyamalan twist at one point, and it's terrible. It is M. Night Shyamalan in that sense as well. It's terrible in the sense that it makes no sense whatsoever. It's not one of those reveals where you're like, oh, I never cottoned onto that, that's very clever. It's that does not make any sense at all. It doesn't make sense in that you play as this character. The character has internal dialogue where they are talking to themselves and ruminating as though they are not the killer. It doesn't really make any sense, and I get the impression that that was kind of like a tacked on ending because they ran out of time or budget or whatever. It's kind of a shame, to be honest. And the killer's motivation at the end is really Freudian and really ridiculous. It's because of something that happened to them in their childhood and they're trying to prove this and that and blah 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 blah. It's kind of dull, to be honest. That said, the game really was notable at the time. It was notable for its production values, which were very high. Its direction was interesting. It does have an interesting atmosphere about it. The form of storytelling is interesting, but also the style of game is interesting. It's a point-and-click adventure, which they didn't exist really outside of indie gaming at the time. 2010 point-and-click adventures were largely dead. There really hadn't been a notable, certainly not a mainstream point-and-click adventure for years and years and years. Then Heavy Rain dropped, and it's this really unusual murder mystery point-and-click adventure. People liked it. There were Let's Plays for it all over YouTube. It really did do quite well. It wasn't really until a few years later that people started regarding it retrospectively and started to see some of the flaws inherent. There are problems with it, like, for example, it's a bit male-gazy at times. There are scenes thrown in for no reason with the female characters that are just there to be lurid, you know? Which, don't get me wrong, in and of themselves, I don't have any problem with, but there's something about the fact that it's only the female characters, and that the scenes don't do anything other than titillate, you know? It's like, oh, come on. I know this is a noir story, and those kinds of scenes are sort of part and parcel, but they could have done something with it. For example, they could have taken those scenes and related them to the serial killer's inability to form proper relationships, for example. Or something to that effect, but they don't. They're just there and don't really have any purpose, you know? They don't really have any purpose. Some of the puzzles, which do involve, sadly, QuickTime events, because 2010 QuickTime events were around quite a lot, they are oblique, to say the least, and you can screw them up so easily. Some of the solutions are abstract. You only understand how to do them through trial and error. So you're going to have to play through either the sequences or the game again to get the different outcomes. Some of them are really weird. What seems to be the obvious way out is not. Some of them which seem to be absurd, ridiculous solutions are the right answers. And that is kind of weird, to be honest. It is kind of weird. There are some of the character developments that are bizarre. At one point, a character comes to believe, because of the manipulations that are being played on him, that he is the origami killer and that he's conducting these murders unconsciously. He's got like a sort of dual personality. He disassociates, essentially. And the game leads you to believe that's true. And that would have made more sense than who the killer turns out to be. It's ultimately a red herring, but that would have made more sense and would have been more interesting than the ultimate ending of the game. It's an odd duck. It's really fascinating for what it did and what it represented to video games, not for what it is. Looking back on it now, if you go and replay it or rewatch it now, parts of it are really problematic. Parts of it are really damn problematic. The story is difficult. It's a bit leaden at times, and the character interactions are strange. They are very, very strange, as are a lot of the motivations. That said, there is still a degree of sentiment for it, because it did change things. It did sort of come out of left field, and it was unlike anything that was around at the time. I suppose present day or more recent examples of games like it would be Detroit, the cyberpunk game. Detroit is actually a way better game than this one. Infinitely better in terms of its technicals, its writing, its story, its direction. But it does have a direct lineage back to Heavy Rain. It plays very like Heavy Rain, actually. And its story structure is very like Heavy Rain. It's just that Detroit is more developed than Heavy Rain was, and is a bit more considered, and is just a better product, you know. But yeah, it was interesting going back and re-experiencing it with 2021 eyes, because a lot of what I appreciated about the game had diminished, and a lot of what I found problematic had risen. It's amazing what a difference a decade makes in video games and in culture in general. There are certain things in Heavy Rain that are really problematic now. Really, really difficult and problematic. Its portrayal of psychology, for example, is... wow, it's bad. It's bad in the way of a badly written murder mystery, you know? Where you do get these portrayals of things like dissociative personality disorder, which are just terrible, of depression, which are just terrible. That said, it's noteworthy because it did address these things, because it actually did tackle these subjects in a video game at a time when the only games that were tackling those subjects were in the independent market, really. So you've got to give it chops for that. It does tackle some really dark, difficult material, and you've got to give it chops for that. That said, it's a mixed bag now. Should you go back and play it, because it was re-released on the PS4 in 2019. It depends. It depends. If you're interested in video game history, then it's an artifact, and it is worth experiencing. I would watch it rather than playing it myself, because it's frustrating to play. Deeply, deeply frustrating indeed. That said, a noteworthy experiment, and certainly something that will be dissected in the manner of a text in things like university courses and whatnot. I've no doubt this is going to come up on university courses about the development of narrative and theme within video games. No doubt at all.